In the quiet cabin of the plane, the two children sat still like stone statues. In front of them, flight attendant Deborah Hayes gripped her intercom tightly, her face pale with anger and confusion. Ethan Brooks lifted his head, his calm but sharp gaze cutting through the air, and spoke. "If necessary, please call the captain directly." Just those few words softly spoken, but the first-class cabin seemed to freeze. Heads began to turn. Whispers started rising. "They have first-class tickets, don't they? Why are they being treated this way?" No shouting, no arguments, just silent resolve more powerful than any noise. No one knew that this small moment, these two quiet children had blown away the wall of prejudice that had existed for so long, and an arrogant power structure was forced to bow its head. If you ever thought you were too small to change anything, this story will make you think again. Welcome to a deeply emotional journey. Just one moment of standing firm can change the entire world. If you enjoy stories that stir the heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading the values of kindness together. Now, let's begin the story. Some days begin with such peace that no one would ever expect them to end in a storm. The morning sunlight streamed through the enormous windows of the international airport, casting soft golden streaks across the polished marble floor. Hundreds of passengers hurried by, pulling their suitcases, their eyes fixed on the flashing electronic boards. Amid the rush of people, two small figures stood still, as if the hurried rhythm of life around them didn't touch them at all. Ethan Brooks, a 17-year-old boy, and his younger sister Sophie Brooks. 15 stood together near the boarding gate, their eyes filled with anticipation. Both were dressed neatly, simple yet elegant. Ethan wore a crisp white shirt and dark jeans, while Sophie wore a light blue summer dress. In her hands, she held a small gift box wrapped in shiny golden paper with a neat bow tied on top. According to Ethan, it was a precious gift for their grandmother on her birthday. In their hands were 2 first-class tickets, and in their hearts was excitement that rivaled the long line of passengers waiting to board the plane. "It will be fine," Ethan said softly, his voice warm and protective as older brothers often are toward their younger sisters. Sophie just nodded slightly, clutching the gift box to her chest as if holding on to a silent prayer. When the airport staff announced the boarding call for first-class passengers, the two siblings walked toward the gate. The staff member smiled politely, scanned their tickets, and nodded. "Have a pleasant flight." There was no warning, no sense of something being amiss, no feeling that something was about to happen. The first-class cabin welcomed them with soft, golden light, plush leather seats, and hushed conversations. A quiet, safe space completely separated from the noise outside. Ethan and Sophie found their seats in row 2 by the window. Ethan carefully placed their carry-on in the overhead compartment, while Sophie gently slid the gift box under the seat in front of her, as if afraid it might slide away. Everything seemed normal, perhaps too normal, until a cold voice suddenly broke the tranquility, sharp as a thin blade. "Excuse me, are you sure you're sitting in the right seats?" Ethan turned his head. Standing in front of them was a tall flight attendant with blonde hair, neatly tied up a perfectly fitted uniform, Deborah Hayes. Her gaze wasn't angry, but it wasn't friendly either. It was scrutinizing, uncomfortable. Ethan calmly handed her their tickets. "We're sitting in 2A and 2B. First class." Deborah glanced at the tickets, but instead of offering an apology or smile, she simply nodded curtly, handed the tickets back, and turned away without saying another word, leaving behind a heavy tension that went unexplained. Sophie tightened her grip on her brother's sleeve. Her eyes filled with concern. Ethan just shook his head slightly, as if to reassure his sister. But deep inside, Ethan knew something was silently brewing. The plane continued to board. One by one, passengers found their seats. The dull thuds of luggage being placed in compartments mixed with the sounds of announcements echoing through the cabin. Ethan and Sophie sat in silence, exchanging glances from time to time. No words were needed. Just keep calm. Wait. But that peace didn't last long. Deborah returned. This time, she didn't ask anything, nor did she request a ticket check. She coldly announced, "I need you two to move to the economy class." Ethan frowned. "We've already shown our first-class tickets." "What's going on?" Deborah crossed her arms in front of her chest, her stance rigid. "There has been a change. These seats are now for other passengers. No explanation, no apology." Sophie looked at her brother, her eyes beginning to tear up. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice still calm, though boiling with anger inside. He lifted his head, replying in a low but firm voice, "We will not move. If necessary, call the captain." A short sentence, but it shattered the tense atmosphere in the first-class cabin. Deborah froze, her expression momentarily flustered. Whispers began to ripple through the rows of seats. Eyes turned toward them. Some were surprised, some were uncomfortable, and others simply observed in silence. Sophie lowered her head, her hands trembling as she took out her phone. A quick message was typed and sent. Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on Deborah, unwavering like a solid wall. And in that moment, everything changed. No shouting, no arguing, just a single sentence, a glance, a message. The airplane, only minutes away from takeoff, suddenly fell silent as though it too could sense the brewing storm. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere thickened. Deborah stood motionless in the aisle, her hand gripping the edge of her uniform, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Under the scrutinizing gaze of the passengers, she slowly pulled out the walkie-talkie from her waistband, pressed a button, and whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Captain, we have a problem. The passengers in seats 2A and 2B refuse to move, requesting assistance." A brief silence followed. Then Captain Mitchell's calm voice came through. "Send me the names of the passengers." Deborah glanced down at the two tickets she was holding. Ethan Brooks. Sophie Brooks. She paused for a moment before answering coldly, "Ethan and Sophie Brooks." The way she read their names was stiff and indifferent, as though they were just two meaningless names in a long list of problems to be dealt with. The first-class cabin suddenly became oppressively silent. Eyes, some furtive, some open, turned toward the two children. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant, Lily Sanders, who had only recently joined the job, hesitated between the rows. Inside, Lily felt a sense of unease rising. She wondered whether she should speak up if something didn't seem right. Lily gripped her notepad tightly in her hand and chose to remain silent. Ethan sat straight, his gaze unwavering. He knew that with enough patience the truth would speak for itself. Sophie, however, was different. She lowered her head, clutching her phone as if holding on to a fragile lifeline. A quiet question slipped into her mind. Why do they hate us, just for being who we are? A light knock came at the cockpit door. Deborah spun around. The door opened slightly, and Captain Mitchell stepped out. His solid appearance with silver streaks at his temples only added to his authoritative presence. Unhurried, Captain Mitchell walked slowly, his eyes scanning the first-class cabin, now holding its breath like a conductor stepping in front of a chaotic orchestra. He stopped in front of Deborah. "Have their tickets been checked?" Deborah nodded, but her gaze avoided his. Captain Mitchell turned his attention to Ethan and Sophie. "Excuse me, may I check your tickets once more, just to be sure?" Without hesitation, Ethan handed over the tickets. Captain Mitchell leaned in to inspect them carefully before nodding. Slowly, "Tickets are completely valid." He turned back to Deborah. This time, his voice was no longer the gentle tone it had once been. "So, what exactly is the problem?" Deborah clenched her lips and fell silent. The atmosphere around them seemed to contract thick with tension. At that moment, a soft beep sounded. A passenger from row 3, someone who had been unnoticed until now, quietly raised their phone. No one knew that, from the moment Deborah had raised her voice at Ethan and Sophie, everything had been broadcast live to the outside world. Her tense face, judging eyes, and harsh tone were quietly spreading beyond the cramped space of the cabin. The storm had begun like a fire rapidly spreading across dry grass. Lily Sanders remained still nearby, her eyes constantly flicking between the main players of the unfolding drama. Inside her, a silent battle was raging. From behind, an exasperated voice rang out. "What the hell is going on?" Another passenger whispered, "They have tickets. Everyone can see that." The whispers began to spread. No longer was there silent complicity. Eyes that had once been indifferent now turned to frustration, even anger. But that anger wasn't directed at Ethan and Sophie. It was aimed at Deborah. Ethan remained motionless like a stone statue. The light from the window cast half of his face in shadow, creating a delicate contrast between light and dark. Sophie leaned in, softly, whispering in his ear, "Do you think everything will be okay?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the front, where Captain Mitchell was engaged in a tense exchange with Deborah. Then, finally, he turned back and gave a small nod. "We have to be patient. Don't let them see us falter." 1 minute, 2 minutes, then 3 minutes passed. Time stretched thin like a delicate thread about to snap. Every gaze in the cabin was fixed on them. 2 first-class tickets. Deborah's cold demeanor. Ethan and Sophie's silent calm. Everything was like a silent play, but one with great weight. And in that moment, a quiet question echoed in the hearts of all those witnessing. If we only see the surface, do we have the right to judge who deserves to sit here? The cockpit door closed softly, and that small sound in cabin XYZ rang out like thunder, signaling that a storm was about to erupt. Deborah stood frozen, her hand still clutching the walkie-talkie, her face flushed red. Beads of sweat dotted her temples. There was no longer any place to hide her confusion. Ethan sat upright, his calm gaze piercing through the uniform, looking into the decaying system she represented. Sophie tightened her grip on her phone, her thumb trembling as it scrolled across the screen. The message she had sent earlier, brief and cold, might now be changing everything. "Uncle Andrew, we need help." Deborah swallowed hard. She pressed the button on the walkie-talkie again, her voice dry and hoarse, requesting support from the ground. 2 passengers refused to leave their seats. Her words echoed through the communication system, reverberating in the tense cabin. Heads turned to look. Some eyes were scrutinizing. Others pretended to be busy with their phones, but no one was truly indifferent anymore. A middle-aged man sitting behind Ethan mumbled, "What's the big deal?" An older woman clicked her tongue in annoyance. "They have tickets. Everyone can see that. Everyone could see They had first-class tickets. It was clear to everyone. The whispers grew louder, striking Deborah's ears like cold needles. In the beverage station, Lily Sanders, the young flight attendant who had only been working for less than 6 months, stood frozen. Her hand trembled as she set the coffee cup down on the counter. A wave of emotion surged in Lily's heart: anger, helplessness. From the moment Deborah had raised her voice at Ethan and Sophie, Lily knew something was terribly wrong. But she also understood that on a flight about to take off, standing up against a superior wasn't simple. Lily turned her head and caught Ethan's gaze through the window. His calm, unresisting gaze silent like a mountain in the midst of a storm. And in that silence, Lily realized that if silence had a sound, it was the loudest scream in the cabin, right now. Less than 3 minutes later, the cockpit door opened, but the person who stepped out wasn't Captain Mitchell. It was a man in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit. The atmosphere in the cabin instantly froze. Andrew Brooks. Some passengers recognized him immediately. Whispers filled the air eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. Ethan gave a slight nod. Sophie looked up, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and doubt. Deborah stood rigid as a statue. She knew exactly who the man was. The entire aviation industry knew Andrew Brooks, co-founder of this airline, a powerful figure whose name was tied to the rise of the company. He moved toward Deborah, each heavy step seeming to dig deeper into the floor. When he was only a few steps away, he spoke in a calm voice. "Who ordered my niece and nephew to leave their valid first-class seats?" Deborah opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The first-class cabin was completely silent. Passengers held their breath. After a moment, she stammered, "I was just following security protocol." Sir Andrew narrowed his eyes. Security protocol or personal prejudice? That gentle question cut into Deborah's chest like a cold blade. A wave of murmurs spread quickly through the rows of seats. In row 3, the man who had been live-streaming from his phone continued to record every moment. The small screen lit up with a flurry of comments. "Oh my God, that's Andrew Brooks. That flight attendant is done for. I can't believe they treated minors like this." Deborah felt it clearly. She wasn't just facing Andrew Brooks. She was facing a public trial, one where no apology could ever erase the stain. Ethan remained still like a rock in the middle of a storm. Sophie clutched his hand, whispering, "Is everything going to be okay?" Ethan nodded slightly. Let the world see the truth. Andrew bent his head slightly toward the 2 children, his eyes full of silent protection. "I'm sorry, today should have been a peaceful day for both of you." Sophie bit her lip, trying to hold back her tears. Ethan just squeezed her hand gently, silently sharing strength. Deborah stepped back, but immediately found herself blocked by 2 uniformed security personnel standing behind her. No one handcuffed her. No one shouted at her. But the silence in the cabin now was more terrifying than any judgment. Deborah bowed her head. She understood. This wasn't just about being fired. It was the end of her career in the airline industry where she had once proudly stood under the spotlight. From a distance, Lily Sanders silently observed. Inside her, there was both a sense of justice being served and a lingering sadness. Just one prejudiced glance had ended a career, Lily told herself. If one day I stand before power, I will choose differently. Andrew Brooks took half a step forward, not angry, not needing to raise his voice, only his resolute eyes showing no hint of leniency. "You didn't just offend my family," he said slowly. "You've betrayed the values this airline stands for." Deborah stammered, I didn't know. Andrew coldly replied, "You didn't need to know." He turned to the two security personnel. "Handle it according to the rules." Deborah didn't resist. She didn't cry. She just silently walked, staggering down the narrow aisle like a ghost caught in the cold, judging gazes of passengers, people she had once looked down on with a mere glance. In row 2, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not out of victory, but from the exhaustion of a battle that should never have happened. Sophie placed her hand on the golden-wrapped gift box, letting out a heavy sigh, and a quiet question echoed in her mind. Is it just because of the color of our skin that they think we don't deserve this? The heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin as Deborah was escorted to the back of the plane by the two security personnel. No handcuffs, no shouting, just a chilling silence tearing apart the false masks of power. She walked with a rigid back feeling, each gaze pierced through her like a spear. Some passengers whispered, others turned their faces away pretending not to see, but no one stood up to defend her anymore. No one believed in Deborah Hayes's innocence anymore. The woman who had once confidently walked the cabin was now nothing more than a lonely figure. In row 2, Ethan Brooks slightly tilted his head, his gaze no longer cold as before. Instead, there was a deep, quiet sadness. Sophie Brooks watched Deborah's figure slowly disappear, her small hands clutching the edge of her dress. "Brother, why do I still feel sad?" Sophie whispered, her voice choked. Ethan gently squeezed his sister's hand, his tone calm. "Because you understand, there's no true victory when someone else falls." Sophie lowered her head, her eyes heavy with emotion. The golden gift box in her lap suddenly felt much heavier, as though it carried the weight of a youth that had to mature too soon. Captain Mitchell stood still in the middle of the cabin, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't need to say anything. His stern gaze alone made every passenger understand that what they had just witnessed was no ordinary incident. A warm announcement came through the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The flight will be delayed for a short time. We apologize for the inconvenience. No one complained, no one grumbled. Everyone understood that this delay was nothing compared to what had just occurred." At the rear of the cabin, Lily Sanders still stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. As Deborah passed by, their eyes met. There was no hatred, no sympathy, only a quiet acknowledgement. Lily knew, and Deborah knew. In Deborah's tired, dark eyes, Lily saw more than words could express. "I've destroyed myself without realizing it." Lily thought. She clenched her fist, and in that moment she understood something deeper. Silence is also a choice, and today that silence had killed a person. Andrew Brooks turned back to the two children. His appearance was still firm, but his gaze softened when directed at Ethan and Sophie. "I'm sorry," he said gently, his voice calm. "You shouldn't have had to go through this." Ethan shook his head slightly. "It's not your fault, and it's not ours either." Sophie looked up, her voice small but clear. "Uncle, do you think one day they'll treat people like us differently?" That simple, heartbreaking question cut deeper than any speech could. Andrew knelt down to her eye level, his hand gently resting on the gift box in Sophie's lap. "I can't promise the world will change overnight," he said. "But because of you two, perhaps some people will begin to think differently." Sophie nodded quietly. In her eyes there was a small flickering hope, like sunlight peeking through after a storm. From a distance, Lily Sanders quietly took out her phone. She didn't record or post anything. She simply opened the Notes app and typed each word, "Today, I witnessed power fall before dignity." She saved the note and put her phone away, for Lily knew that this lesson would stay with her for life. No photo was needed to remind her. From the front, a soft sound echoed. Two airport coordinators entered the cabin, their demeanor serious yet calm. A middle-aged man in a dark gray suit, perhaps a representative of the airline, approached Andrew Brooks and whispered something. Andrew nodded, then turned to look at Ethan and Sophie. "We'll be leaving the plane in a few minutes. They've arranged another flight for us." Ethan and Sophie stood up at the same time. No applause, no cheers, just a quiet respect spreading across the rows of seats. In the private waiting room, Deborah Hayes gripped her old handbag tightly, as though holding on to the last shred of her pride. She bowed her head, her phone constantly vibrating with messages, missed calls, and notifications from social media. But Deborah didn't dare to open it. She didn't need to open it. She knew her story had spread, not because of who she was, but because of what she had done and the price she had to pay. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophie made their way toward the plane door, walking between the narrow rows of seats. Passengers on either side quietly moved their seats to create a wider aisle. A small gesture, but in that moment it was worth more than any belated apology. An elderly woman near the door nodded lightly as Ethan walked past. A middle-aged man softly said, "Thank you, children." Ethan responded with a faint smile. Sophie tightened her grip on the gift box, walking faster, as if to escape the weight of the tension and the quiet respect pressing down on her shoulders. And then, as the two siblings stepped through the metal door and left the plane cabin behind, another world awaited them outside. A world that was not easy, but at least today they knew that they had not bowed their heads, and sometimes standing firm in the storm is already a victory. The hallway leading out of the plane stretched before Ethan and Sophie like a bridge, pulling them away from the storm that had just passed, exposing the true faces of those who had hidden behind the facade of uniforms. Outside, the cold white light of the airport flooded the exit, illuminating every small detail. Neatly arranged suitcases, airport staff standing at attention, their eyes glancing hesitantly. In a distant corner, a group of reporters were already present, their cameras poking out from behind barriers, microphones raised high like spears waiting to strike. Andrew Brooks walked beside the two children, his figure strong as an old oak, his sharp eyes quickly scanning the scene. He gave a subtle hand gesture. Immediately, a team of security staff in black vests quietly formed a human wall separating Ethan Brooks and Sophie Brooks from the growing chaos of the crowd. There were no shouts, no commands. True power doesn't need to be loud. In the airport's administrative area, Deborah Hayes sat slumped in a cold plastic chair, her hands tightly clutching the edge of her jacket. Across from her was the area manager, a man in his 50s wearing a perfectly pressed suit, his face cold and devoid of emotion. He placed a file on the table, opening it with precise, impersonal movements. Deborah Hayes. He began his voice flat, as if reading a formal indictment. By direct order from the Board of Directors and confirmed by CEO Andrew Brooks, your employment contract is hereby terminated. Effective immediately, Deborah's body shook. "I didn't mean to." She weakly protested. The manager's face remained unchanged. "Intentions do not erase consequences. What you've done has far exceeded the acceptable limits." He slid a piece of paper toward her. "This is the termination notice. Please sign." Deborah stared at the paper. The words seemed to sink into her eyes. dismissed for discriminatory behavior towards a passenger causing severe damage to the company's image and violating the airline's conduct regulations. Just 3 short lines, yet they severed both her past and her future. Outside the passenger area, the news spread like wildfire. The giant screens in the airport constantly flashed breaking news. Flight attendant fired mid-flight for discriminatory behavior towards CEO's family. Exclusive video captures the shocking incident. Under each headline, hundreds of thousands of comments flooded in, mostly anger, some sympathy, but all of them stunned. Lily Sanders sat quietly near the boarding gate, the light from her phone casting shadows on her face as she reflected the viral videos spreading across social media. A video played showing Deborah, her face tense, her finger pointing directly at Ethan and Sophie, her sharp voice echoing through the silent cabin. A cold caption appeared below. "This is the true face of prejudice. This is why silence is complicity." Lily swallowed hard, a wave of guilt tightening in her chest. I was there, and I was silent in the office. Deborah signed the termination notice with a trembling hand, almost tearing the paper. The manager silently placed the punched employee ID badge on the table in front of her. No name tag, no uniform, no place to return to. Have you ever thought that a single contemptuous glance could ruin a life? If you ever believed that power would always protect you, this story will make you think again. Deborah stood up, clutching the small bag containing the last fragments of her career. A pen, a nameplate, a notebook full of notes, now useless. She walked out of the office just in time to see the large screens broadcasting images of herself. No one patted her on the back. No one stopped beside her. Deborah walked like a ghost alone in the sea of silent onlookers. In another area of the airport, Ethan and Sophie sat in a VIP lounge prepared for them. Sophie rested her head on her brother's shoulder, sighing softly. "Ethan, do you think she regrets it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He gazed out the window where the plane stood still under the dimming sunlight. "She might," he whispered. "But unfortunately, regret doesn't undo what's already happened." Andrew Brooks entered the room, his gaze softening as he saw the 2 children safe and sound. "You both did very well," he said as he sat down across from them, his voice warm. "Your silence, your patience, it resonates louder than any accusations." Ethan nodded slightly. Shouting doesn't always bring victory. Andrew smiled the first time that day. Exactly. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing how to stay silent and let the truth speak for itself. Outside the airport, the crowd began to thin. But the story had already rooted itself in social media posts, in the news, in the dinner conversations of thousands of families across the country. And an unspoken question kept repeating itself in everyone's heart. If Ethan and Sophie hadn't stood up, if they had chosen to stay silent, how much more injustice would the world overlook? The camera flashes blinked incessantly in the airport hall. Reporters crowded microphones raised high like sharp spears, creating a chaotic storm of noise. In a corner of the staff hallway, Deborah Hayes quietly pressed herself against the wall near the exit to the parking lot. Her uniform jacket hastily draped over her shoulder, both to hide and to hold on to the last shred of dignity she had left. But it was in vain. She could feel every gaze pierce her back like daggers. Each whisper, each camera flash felt like invisible cuts tearing into her soul. Across the airport, the screens continuously updated with the sensational headlines. Former flight attendant Deborah Hayes fired for discriminatory behavior on Flight XYZ statement from CEO Andrew Brooks. no tolerance for any form of discrimination. Every time the screen changed, every time Deborah's image appeared pointing at Ethan and Sophie, she felt herself stripped bare, exposed to the world's judgment. In the VIP lounge, Ethan and Sophie silently watched the screens through the soundproof glass. Sophie clenched the armrest. Her lips pressed tightly together. Ethan gently placed his hand on his sister's shoulder. "You don't need to be scared anymore." Sophie nodded faintly, but deep inside she still carried an unspoken question. When will the world stop judging people? By the first glance, a question that is not easy to answer. In a quiet corner of the airport, Lily Sanders stood motionless, her eyes fixed on her phone screen. A message from a colleague appeared sharp like a jab to her heart. "Lily, did you know the press is looking for witnesses?" Someone saw the incident. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Lily's heart pounded so loudly she felt as though it might break her chest. In her mind, the images rushed back. Deborah yelling Ethan and Sophie silently enduring, and herself just standing there helpless and silent. A heavy silence enveloped her mind. If I keep silent, am I any different from those who turn their backs on the truth? Lily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze had changed. No more hesitation, no more fear. In a secluded exit, Deborah Hayes hurriedly walked, trying to avoid the prying eyes, but her efforts quickly evaporated. A group of reporters waited like vultures hunting prey. Cameras, microphones, and relentless questions bombarded her like arrows. "Ms. Hayes, do you have anything to say about the discrimination incident? Do you know who you've offended? Do you regret it?" Deborah lowered her head, walking faster, but her steps wobbled and trembled as though she were trying to escape the epicenter of a massive earthquake. At the same time, inside the airline's operations center, Andrew Brooks stood in front of the giant screens surrounded by the media team. The faces of his assistants were tense, their eyes anxious. One advisor spoke up. "We need to issue a second statement. The public is demanding transparency." Andrew Brooks nodded, his voice firm, without hesitation. "No evasion, no cover-ups. Speak plainly. This is discriminatory behavior, and our airline will never accept that." He paused for a moment, then added, "And make sure it's clear. No uniform, no title can justify trampling on human dignity." He turned his gaze sharp as a blade. "Do you think a single impulsive moment can't ruin a career? Think again. Just one wrong look can make you lose everything. If this story makes you reflect, don't forget to share it, so lessons like this are not forgotten." In the waiting area, Lily Sanders stood up. She walked quickly toward the press area, each step cutting through the fear that had gripped her for hours. A security guard stopped her. "Excuse me, what is your purpose?" Lily raised her head high. "I am a witness." Flashes of light flickered constantly. Cameras and microphones clashed together like a storm. Deborah Hayes stood motionless under the harsh spotlight, her face pale as paper. A reporter raised a microphone, their voice booming. "Miss Hayes, did you know there's a witness speaking out?" "A flight attendant from the same flight. Lily Sanders has confirmed that you asked passengers to move without any valid safety reason." The words fell like thunder on a clear sky. Deborah froze her eyes frantically, searching through the crowd. She hoped to see Lily, hoping for a glimpse of hope. But all she found was a sea of cold camera lenses and glances that seemed to burn her alive. The world, which had once been her refuge, had now completely turned its back on her. In the VIP lounge, Ethan Brooks and Sophie Brooks stood by the window silently watching the events unfold. The evening sunlight painted the marble floor with a golden hue. Sophie whispered, "Ethan, do you think she regrets it?" Ethan paused thoughtfully. After a moment, he quietly replied, "Maybe, but sometimes regret comes too late." Across the airport screens, breaking news continuously flashed. Flight attendant fired after racial discrimination incident. Witness confirms the truth, and underneath a small yet striking line appeared, "Silence can be complicity, but sometimes silence can also be courage when it stands with the truth." The sunset filled the vast hallway with its warm light. Under its glow, Deborah Hayes dragged her weary steps as though each step might cause the ground to collapse beneath her. In her coat pocket, her punched employee ID pressed against her palm, cold and a constant reminder that everything was truly over. Near the administrative area's exit, a group of reporters had already lined up cameras up, microphones raised high. With each step, Deborah took more gazes drilled into her, scrutinizing, condemning. Suddenly, a man in a black suit stepped out, blocking her path. No introductions, no formalities. Everyone in the airport knew who he was, Andrew Brooks. He stood there like an immovable wall between Deborah and the rest of the world. The air froze. Deborah stopped facing the most powerful man she had ever known, and in that moment she understood the most painful truth of the day. The price of a single contemptuous glance wasn't just losing her job, it was losing her dignity. Not the dignity of others, but the respect she once had for herself. Andrew Brooks spoke in a low, cold voice like the sharpest blade, Deborah Hayes. All cameras turned toward them. Every microphone was live. Deborah clenched her fists. She knew she could not run. There was no escape. He looked her straight in the eyes, his voice piercing her heart. "Do you understand why you're standing here today?" Deborah tried to speak 1,000 excuses stuck in her throat. Finally, she weakly uttered a sentence. I didn't mean to. I was just following the protocol." A faint smile flickered at the corner of Andrew's mouth. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was the cold, unfeeling smile of raw truth. Protocol. His voice was calm, freezing. What protocol teaches you to judge others based solely on their skin color without even checking their tickets? Deborah lowered her head. The sounds of cameras snapping filled the air, each click like a whip lashing against her already crumbling back. In the midst of the flashing lights and cameras, Deborah Hayes finally understood what she had lost today was not just her job, but everything that once defined her. In a hidden corner near the media area, Lily Sanders stood still, hiding behind a pillar. Her phone vibrated lightly with a new message. "Lily, the press is looking for witnesses." Someone who was there, her hand clenched around the phone, her gaze fixed on the screen. Her whole body seemed to freeze. She remembered everything, Deborah Hayes yelling, Ethan Brooks and Sophie Brooks silently enduring, and herself just standing there motionless. A heavy silence pressed down on her mind. If I stay silent, am I any different from those who turn a blind eye to the truth? Lily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then opened her eyes again. Her gaze, once clear and uncertain, had hardened. A new courage had been ignited within her. She had signed the official witness statement with the airline representative. A small step, but one heavy enough to change the course of her fate. Lily understood she couldn't change the past, but she could refuse to stand with wrong again. Across from her, Andrew Brooks stared directly at Deborah Hayes. His voice was deep but carried a resonating weight with every word. You didn't just disrespect these children. He paused, his gaze locking on to Deborah like an unappealable sentence. You've offended everyone who has ever been judged because of their appearance. Deborah clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her skin and blood began to seep out. But she did not raise her head. She knew now there was nothing left to defend. What would you do when you realize your silence has become the loudest scream against justice? Never underestimate the weight of choices that seem small. They can determine the course of your entire life. Andrew Brooks didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to bang his fist. He only stood there silent and let that silence speak. And in that moment, Deborah Hayes felt a shame more painful than any punishment. A young reporter stepped forward, microphone shaking slightly in his hand. Ms. Hayes, would you like to issue a formal apology to the passengers and the public? Deborah closed her eyes, gathering all her strength to take a deep breath. When she opened her eyes were bloodshot and her voice trembled like a leaf in a storm. I'm sorry. But who was she apologizing to? What for? No one was clear. Perhaps even Deborah didn't know. The final click of a camera shutter sounded, and then everything fell into silence. Deborah turned, walking towards the staff parking lot in the pale evening light. Each step seemed to drag behind it a part of her past that could never be salvaged. In the VIP lounge, Ethan Brooks leaned back in his chair, his eyes calmly gazing out through the large window. Sophie Brooks gently tugged at his sleeve, asking in a small voice. She apologized. Is that enough? Ethan thought for a long time, before quietly replying, It's enough for today. He paused, his gaze still following the light fading outside the runway, but not enough for all the days that have passed. At the press area, Lily Sanders stepped out of the witness confirmation area. She sighed as if a heavy stone had finally been lifted from her chest after being weighed down for so long. The witness statement felt fragile in her hand, but to Lily it was a vow. From today forward, she would never stand still in the face of injustice. Outside the airport, screens flashed with breaking news continuously. Flight XYZ, a moment of silence that shook the airline industry. And amidst all the noise, a quiet yet powerful truth began to rise. Justice doesn't need to scream to be heard. It only needs people brave enough to stand tall when the world forces them to bow. Beneath the warm yellow light, the airport seemed to be preparing for another storm. The air felt thick, heavy, like a pause before a roar. Deborah Hayes sat down on a bench near the exit. She clutched a worn fabric bag holding the remnants of a career that had evaporated. The sounds of heels clicking, phones ringing, and cameras snapping relentlessly echoed around her. Deborah, once a model of professionalism, was now a name synonymous with shame. Every screen, every online article, every social media post was filled with her image. Former flight attendant Deborah Hayes faces backlash after discrimination scandal. The public is outraged, demanding a lifetime ban from the airline industry. Under these headlines, thousands of comments poured in like a flood. She deserves to be banned forever from the industry. Sorry isn't enough. Thank you to the brave children who taught us a lesson. In the lounge, Sophie turned to her brother, softly asking, Ethan, do you think anything will change? Ethan stayed silent for a long time. He looked out towards the airport where the planes were taking off into the deepening night, their lights flashing. Maybe not right away, but somewhere someone will start thinking differently after today. A soft knock at the door interrupted. An airline staff member politely announced, "We've arranged for a private car to take you to the airport. Mr. Brooks is waiting at the headquarters." Ethan stood up, offering his hand to his sister. The two siblings walked together, backs straight, chins lifted, carrying with them a silent strength that no VIP pass could bestow. The strength of dignity. Deborah Hayes sat there like stone. Her phone vibrated endlessly in her bag. Calls from unknown numbers, messages, emails, social media, alerts pouring in like a violent storm. A message popped up. "Heather, this is your lawyer. Don't speak to the press. Anything you say now can be used against you." Deborah dropped the phone, her eyes hollow. Who am I fighting against? When the whole world has already sentenced me, who do I fight? She had once believed that only shouting could move the world. But today she realized that it is the resilient silence that can break down the deepest of prejudices. In the airport's center, multiple media outlets had set up live broadcast areas. A large headline filled the screen. "Airline holds press conference after discrimination scandal." A brief press release was sent out. "We don't just apologize, we commit to change." No form of discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, is allowed in our culture. Deborah stared at the screen, her eyes blazing red. Though her name wasn't directly mentioned, everyone knew it was all about her. An old colleague walked by, not stopping, not even offering a nod. No one wanted to be associated with her. No one wanted to be involved. Deborah hugged herself, trembling like a lost child in the storm. At the headquarters of the airline, Andrew Brooks sat across from his senior advisors. On the table, the final documents had been completed. He scanned the decisive words with his eyes. "Is this statement clear enough?" A lawyer nodded. "Yes, sir. Not only clear, but it will become a pledge for the entire airline industry." Andrew Brooks closed his eyes for a moment, but in his mind he no longer saw the cold meeting room. He saw the image of two children sitting silently in first class. No shouting, no crying, no loud protests, just quietly holding on to their dignity like small warriors. At the same time, Lily Sanders left the press area. Her heart was heavy, but each step now felt steadier than ever. She knew from this day forward she would no longer be the compliant girl her colleagues once knew. She would be the one who dared to speak out. And sometimes that title comes at a very high price. But Lily had no regrets. For the first time in her life, she knew she had stood on the right side. Outside the airport, Deborah Hayes walked into the twilight sky. In front of her, hanging in midair, was a massive electronic billboard. The cold white letters appeared. "Respect is not a choice. It is a requirement." Deborah stared at it. The simple words weighed heavily on her chest like an unspoken sentence. She knew no airline would accept her anymore. No second chance. No road to return. In the private car, quietly leaving the airport, Sophie Brooks leaned her head against the window, the airport lights blurring into faint streaks. "Ethan, do you think they will still remember us?" Ethan smiled gently. "Maybe they'll forget our names, but the lesson will stay forever." At the airport, the stage lights dimmed, leaving only one unspoken question resonating in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. How many more times will we remain silent in the face of injustice? Or will we stand up when it truly matters? The sunset slowly fell over the vast airport, the last rays of light reflecting off the flickering electronic screens. And in that light, Deborah Hayes's shadow stretched long like an unhealed wound. No applause, no farewells, only cold, unfamiliar gazes, whispers like an undercurrent. With every step she took, it felt like carrying an entire mountain on her shoulders. Outside the main gate, a group of people gathered. No banners, no cheering. They just stood there, silent, their eyes icy. Some raised their phones to film. Others pointed, whispered, and shook their heads. Deborah pulled up her collar, walking faster as if she could leave all those looks behind, as if she could escape a sentence that didn't need a judge. In coffee shops, on buses and offices glowing with light across the city, the story continued to spread quietly. Did you hear she was fired right at the airport? It's well-deserved. Discrimination, right on the flight, unforgivable. Those kids didn't even argue, and they still shook the world. At the airline's media center, the press conference was taking place. Andrew Brooks sat before dozens of camera lenses, the stage lights casting shadows over his composed figure. He didn't avoid. He didn't beat around the bush. His voice was warm but firm. Discrimination in any form goes against our core values. He sipped his cocoa, his eyes gazing far through the large window. Then he slowly added, "Some changes happen immediately. Some take a generation. But every time someone dares to stand up, or at least refuses to bow before injustice, the world will change even if just a little." In the public relations office, a short video had been widely broadcast across the country. The film began with the image of 2 first-class tickets neatly placed on an airplane seat. Then, one by one, faces appeared, the elderly children, white, yellow, black, and finally, a simple line appeared on the dark screen. Each face tells a story. Each seat deserves respect. No narration, no commentary, only silence, lingering long after the screen went black. At the staff parking lot, Deborah Hayes finally started the car. The headlights cut through the thin mist, illuminating the way for the old car to leave the airport. No one stopped her. No one called her name. She slid into the night like a ghost. Not because she lost her job, not because she lost her reputation, but because she had lost her belief in herself. At a small hotel not far away, Ethan and Sophie Brooks sat on the second-floor balcony, their legs dangling over the low railing. The silver moonlight bathed their hair in a delicate glow. Sophie leaned over and asked softly, "Ethan, do you think we'll face something like this again?" Ethan silently thought for a while, then smiled gently. "Maybe, but next time we'll know what to do." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining with trust. The next morning, the city woke up with fresh news. The news about Deborah Hayes was gradually replaced by other hot stories, but the story of Flight XYZ quietly lived on in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Not like a scandal, but like a reminder that silence doesn't mean agreement, and steadfastness doesn't have to be loud. Andrew Brooks walked with Ethan and Sophie to the car. Before the door closed, he bent down and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you know what makes me the most proud?" Ethan tilted his head, his eyes bright. Andrew smiled, his gaze full of warmth. "It's not power. It's not protection. It's when, despite being treated unfairly, you still choose kindness." In the quiet cabin of the car, Ethan Brooks sat still, his gaze deeply fixed on the faint streaks of light on the horizon. No words were spoken, but it was in that silence that the echoes of everything felt louder than any scream. He nodded slightly, slowly, like someone who had just absorbed a lesson heavier than 1,000 burdens. The car rolled forward, taking Ethan and Sophie Brooks away from the city, the place that had witnessed a turning point in their lives. Through the window, the morning light began to creep in, painting the sky with the first strokes of a new chapter. Elsewhere, Deborah Hayes also drove her old car away from the city. Her small figure slowly disappeared into the fog. No cameras followed her. No applause sent her off. Only the sound of the old tires grinding on the road dragging behind it, a past she could never return to. The story ended there. No perfect ending, no grand victory, only growth, silent, steadfast, like a tree whose roots run deep through the storms. The final message rang clear throughout Ethan and Sophie's tumultuous journey, intertwined with the bitter fall of Deborah Hayes. A simple yet unwavering truth was etched deep. Respect is not a reward for status, fame, or power. Respect is a natural right of every human being. No conditions, no debates. Ethan and Sophie didn't need to shout. They didn't need to argue. It was their steady silence that became the loudest voice exposing injustice, confronting prejudice, and shaking a system that had long been used to turn in a blind eye. Deborah was not knocked down by a reckless act. She failed because of the quiet, ingrained discrimination, a habit she had never stopped to question. Was what I'm doing right? And when the flame of justice ignited, it wasn't because the crowd screamed, but because there were people who dared not look away. The real lessons this story leaves. Not every raised voice brings change. Sometimes it is the quiet patience and persistent courage that is the most powerful weapon against injustice. Never judge a person solely by their appearance. A first-class ticket, a well-tailored suit, or even a youthful face, none of these define a person's worth. How we treat others truly reflects who we are. Power has never been eternal. When abused, it will quickly fall under the weight of truth and morality. Every silence is a choice. Silence to cover up injustice is complicity. But silence to preserve dignity waiting for the right moment is strength. Social change doesn't always come from those in power. Sometimes it begins with two young souls, a steady gaze, and a simple refusal. We will not move. Respect must become a living culture, not an empty slogan. No organization, no regime can last long if it denies human dignity. In summary, when faced with injustice, remember you don't have to shout, you don't need to rebel. Just stand firm and let your silence speak louder than any noise, because sometimes, just by not yielding, you have enough power to change the world. Once again, Andrew Brooks sat at the press conference holding a steaming cup of cocoa. His gaze went far beyond the room towards values much greater than profit or fame. One of the advisors asked him, "Sir, do you think our statement will have an impact?" Andrew smiled softly, his eyes shining with a faraway look. Some changes happen in an instant. Some changes take an entire generation. But each time someone dares to stand tall or simply refuses to bow, the world shifts, even if only a little. At the airline's media center, the campaign was complete. A special video was broadcasted nationwide. It opened with two first-class tickets neatly placed on a shiny leather seat. Then came the faces of passengers of all skin colors, ages, and backgrounds. And finally, a simple line appeared on the screen. Each face tells a story. Each seat deserves respect. No narration, no booming music, just a lasting silence lingering in the hearts of viewers. At the airport, Deborah Hayes finally started the car. The headlights cut through the thin mist illuminating the path for the old car to leave the airport. No one stopped her. No one called her name. She slid into the night like a ghost. Not because she lost her job, not because she lost her reputation, but because she had lost her belief in herself. At a small hotel not far away, Ethan and Sophie Brooks sat on the second-floor balcony, their legs dangling lazily over the low railing. The silver moonlight bathed their hair in a delicate glow. Sophie leaned over and asked softly, "Ethan, do you think we'll face something like this again?" Ethan thought for a moment, then smiled gently. "Maybe. But next time we'll know how to stand stronger." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining like tiny stars. The next morning, the city woke up to a new rush. Hot news stories flooded the headlines, but the story of Flight XYZ quietly continued to live on in the minds of those who witnessed it. No longer a scandal, but like an underground current reminding everyone that silence doesn't mean agreement, and steadfastness doesn't have to be loud. Andrew Brooks walked with Ethan and Sophie to the car. Before the door closed, he bent down and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you know what makes me the most proud?" Ethan tilted his head, his eyes bright. Andrew smiled, his gaze full of warmth. "It's not power, it's not protection, it's when despite being treated unfairly, you still choose kindness, and your silence has echoed louder than any scream." The car quietly rolled forward, taking Ethan and Sophie away from the city that had marked a turning point in their lives. Outside the window, the first light of day broke open in a new chapter, quietly but full of hope. The first light of day filtered through the window, casting gentle golden streaks across the sky. A new day began. A new chapter quietly unfolded. In the distance, Deborah Hayes drove her old car away from the city. Her small figure slowly disappeared into the dense gray fog. No cameras followed, no farewell applause, only the soft, mournful sound of the worn-out tires grinding along the road, dragging a past where the future and the past would never again cross paths. The story closed there. No perfect ending, no dazzling victory, only growth. Steadfast, silent, like an ancient tree that has withstood countless storms. The final message from Ethan and Sophie Brooks' journey and the bitter downfall of Deborah Hayes rang out clearly. Respect is not a reward for status, fame, or power. Respect is a fundamental, inviolable right of every human being. Ethan and Sophie didn't need to shout. They didn't need to argue or debate. Their quiet resolve became the strongest voice exposing injustice, challenging prejudice, and shaking a system long accustomed to turning a blind eye. Deborah Hayes didn't fall due to a momentary mistake. She collapsed because of the silent, accumulated biases, because she never once asked herself, "Is what I'm doing right?" And when the fire of justice ignited, it didn't come from the shouting crowds, but from those brave enough to choose not to turn away. The real lessons this story leaves. Raising your voice doesn't always bring change. Sometimes it is the patient silence and steadfast courage that is the most powerful weapon against injustice. Never judge a person by appearances. A first-class ticket, an expensive suit, or even a youthful face. None of these determine a person's worth. How we treat others truly defines who we are. Power has never been eternal. When abused, it will quickly shatter under the weight of truth and dignity. Every silence is a choice. Silence that covers up injustice is complicity, but silence that preserves dignity, waiting for the right moment, is strength. Social change doesn't always come from those with power. It can start with two young souls, a calm gaze and a simple declaration. We will not move. Respect must become a living culture, not just a slogan. No organization, no system can survive if it disregards human dignity. In summary, when faced with injustice, remember that you don't necessarily have to scream. You don't need to revolt. Just stand firm and let your dignified silence resonate louder than any noise, because sometimes, simply by not yielding, you have enough power to change the world. Once again, the image of Andrew Brooks sitting quietly at the press conference surfaced. In his hand, the warm cup of cocoa still steamed. His gaze was not focused on the bright room, but instead on deeper things beyond. And he slowly repeated, "Some changes come instantly. Some changes take a generation. But each time someone chooses to stand firm or simply refuses to bow, this world will shift even if it's just a small step." The small car carrying Ethan and Sophie Brooks drove away from the city, a place that had witnessed the moment when two small souls made a monumental change. The dawn light broke over the horizon, signaling the beginning of a new chapter. Behind them in the mist, Deborah Hayes quietly vanished, carrying regrets that would never fade. She had lost not only her job, but, more importantly, her trust in herself. But this story, more than just a sad ending, is a powerful reminder. Respect is not a gift granted based on status or appearance. Respect is the inherent right of all of us. Ethan and Sophie didn't need to shout to demand justice. It was their steadfast silence that resonated louder than any noise breaking the mask of a system that had long been used to turning a blind eye. Real change is not always loud. It begins with those brave enough to stand tall when everyone else around them bows their head. Never judge someone by their first impression. Never think that silence equates to weakness, because sometimes just one moment of refusal to yield can make the world a better place. If you were moved alongside Ethan and Sophie, if your heart also resonated with that silent strength, remember, when facing injustice, you don't need to shout. You just need to stand firm, holding on to your dignity, and then you'll see, even silence can change the world. Thank you for listening to this story to the very end. If you believe the world needs more acts of kindness, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading the power of courage and kindness. See you in the next stories.